Welcome back to Medicine with Meaning with Dr. Julie Ta. In this episode, we're diving into a powerful idea. Your story is data. The symptoms you feel aren't random. They carry meaning, and when we learn to listen, they can guide us towards real healing. Today, Dr. Julie shares personal experiences, patient lessons, and a new way to look at your health story with compassion and curiosity. Let's get started. Dr. Julie, you often say medicine with meaning is about listening to the messages in your symptoms. Can you take us back to the very first time you personally experienced a symptom that had meaning for you?
Yeah, this particular event occurred early in my career, and it was around the same time that I started learning about mind-body medicine. So let me tell my story. I had spent about 3 days cooking and preparing for a large dinner party. So I was excited and nervous about this gathering. While I was getting dressed for the party, I broke out in hives all over my body. And I remember wearing a hot pink cocktail dress, and the rash all over my chest and neck and arms matched the color of my dress. And this made me more nervous about the party and greeting my guests. And I knew that the hives were triggered by my nervous system. I was feeling quite nervous about the party. And I also knew that I wasn't an allergic person. I didn't have a history of hives, so it was my nervous system. Well, my husband looked at me and he said, "Breathe." So I closed my eyes and I just started breathing, practiced deep breathing. And luckily I was able to calm my nervous system, and the hives magically disappeared before my first guest arrived. And during this time, I had read a lot about mind-body medicine. I learned that we could control our nervous system, we could lower our blood pressure, we can improve symptoms of pain and anxiety. But it was so meaningful for me to experience firsthand that I can control my nervous system, and that I immediately felt the benefits of deep breathing. And so it's a poignant example of how our nervous system can trigger symptoms in our body. And by calming my mind and my nervous system, I literally was able to reverse the hives. And I think what was most meaningful for me was, again, knowing that I could control my nervous system. And if I can do it, others can do it also.
Wow, that's so powerful and so immediate. I think this is such a good proof that we can calm ourselves and our body will shortly make it evident. Yeah.
I think, it was all theoretical for me as I was reading and studying. I believed it. The evidence in the medical literature, showed that, but to experience it firsthand made it very real for me. And I think that was also the first time that I had realized, oh, my body is sensitive to stress. This was, very early in my career. When I hadn't experienced as much stress as later on in my career.
So in medical school and residency, you were trained to see symptoms through the biomedical lens. What was the moment you realized that model alone wasn't enough? Was this story that you just told us a part of it? Or?
Oh, not really. So as an internal medicine physician like myself, actually, most doctors spend the majority of medical training in the hospital. We care for acute conditions like heart attacks or strokes or serious infections. But for many doctors, after we graduate and complete our training, we work in the outpatient setting and care for people with chronic conditions like diabetes and hypertension, or chronic symptoms like fatigue or pain. No, the biomedical model still serves us in understanding pathophysiology and root cause. However, so many chronic conditions are driven by poor lifestyle, and they're certainly worsened by stress. So in this scenario, we need the art of medicine, right? This is to forge a relationship and build trust with our patients and gather what's called the psychosocial spiritual story. In other words, we need to understand the whole person and their whole life story. What were their life stressors and what are they currently? This is important because it can provide clues for root causes or mediators of their chronic condition. All of this data is important to motivate behavioral change and understand what are the barriers to incorporating our lifestyle treatment plan. For instance, when I work with busy people who have the goal of increasing movement, I often have them walk me through a typical day so that we can brainstorm where they can fit exercise into their day. Many of my patients don't have time to go to the gym. So one strategy that I've come up with is I recommend that they schedule what are called exercise snacks throughout the day. These are 3 to 5 minute body weight exercises that they can do wherever they are. Hopefully they're dressed in some comfortable work clothes and they can do squats or jumping jacks or lunges or push-ups, etc. And you got to get creative with some people based on their lifestyle. And because stress is such a big driver of disease, it's important to understand more about their stressors so that we can address this underlying root cause. And though deep breathing and meditation are useful mind-body tools, they may not be enough to move the needle. And we need to identify what is triggering the stress. And this awareness is the necessary first step to making meaningful change in a person's life. And also the person needs support to make these lifestyle changes, which will lower stress in their body and mind.
Wow. So I've been working a lot on my computer. I spend a lot of time working on my computer and I'm an active person, but I feel like sometimes we just go to the gym 1 hour or an hour and a half, but the rest of the day you're sitting. So those workout snacks or exercise snacks or movement snacks, I don't know, is a very helpful tip for listeners because now I'm going to even do that. 'Cause
Yeah.
it adds up, right? Like 5 minutes every so often, then you have an hour of body weight there or resistance.
Yeah. So my goal there is, to fit in exercise, right? Or movement. But it could even just be stretching, right? For me, I carry a lot of tension in my shoulders and just getting up every hour to move or stretch is probably something we should all do, even if we go to the gym, right? But in this scenario, it's a creative way for someone to work in some strength training in their day. So yeah, you have to understand what that person's life looks like in order to make recommendations that are doable. And sometimes this is, you start small and build upon it.
Yes. Otherwise, it's overwhelming if you start with all these big goals, but you don't even have the basics. Then it's so easy to quit because all of a sudden it seems unachievable. And yeah, like you mentioned, the support part, of course, to be with a functional medicine doctor, a physician that can support your journey, but also, as we spoke in the last episode, the community or who you surround yourself with also reinforces your habits.
That is for sure. They say birds of the same feathers flock together. You certainly adopt behaviors of the people around you. And so if you're surrounded by healthy-minded people, you have a better chance of being healthy.
And Dr. Julie, would you say that most diseases, because you mentioned a lot of them are a result of poor lifestyle? When you have a disease, there's something that you're doing that isn't working for you. Is that a clue?
Well, classic examples that I presented earlier are diabetes and hypertension. They can be treated with lifestyle changes. Now, some people need to take medications in addition, but as a foundation, nutrition and movement and sleep too are so important for optimizing that disease, right? I know we're going to talk more about the ecosystem of health, but for somebody who is a diabetic, you certainly want to lower stress. I think stress, while it has so many effects on the body and causes inflammation, but I think stress indirectly impacts us because we're more likely to more likely to have unhealthy habits as a coping mechanism, right? In our natural state, or my natural state, I should say. And so addressing stress is important, and getting that person to create an ecosystem that supports diabetes, which is optimizing their nutrition, eating less sugar and simple carbohydrates, getting more movement that metabolizes the glucose, right? Building muscle, which creates a healthier metabolism. So those are lifestyle changes that are supportive of somebody with diabetes.
Thank you for that, Dr. Julie. I think that many listeners can benefit from those tips to start their journey on a healthier path. And I've heard you talk about your frozen shoulder before. What was happening in your life then? How did it force you to reevaluate your health and choices?
Yeah. Well, at the time I had an intense and stressful job. My children were young. I also had aging parents, who were getting sick. So I was doing a lot of caregiving, right? Caring for my family, my patients. I also managed a team of clinicians, and so, was caring for them, but I wasn't caring for myself. And, I wasn't practicing self-care. And I think it was mostly because I was so busy, right? As a working mom, I wanted to spend that extra time with my children. I felt guilty if I went to the gym. And so, I wasn't taking care of myself. And I started to notice that, I was irritable, or I was, not in a good mood. Those were the early signs. And, then it took a toll on my body, right? Where, I started to get shoulder pain. And at first it was mild. I didn't injure myself. I wasn't really working out at the time. And, I noticed that little by little, the mobility in my shoulder became very limited, to the point where I couldn't put on my jacket. I couldn't fasten my bra from the back, right? And so this was classic frozen shoulder. It's actually something that's very common for middle-aged women. We actually don't know the exact cause, but it's certainly triggered by inflammation, and the inflammation causes scarring and fibrosis of the shoulder capsule. So for me, definitely my intense job, taking care of so many people, and not taking care of myself were drivers of my frozen shoulder. I also want to share that, I did all the right things, right? I took anti-inflammatory medications. I went to physical therapy, and it still did not improve. So I did some self-care, medical care, right? And frozen shoulder actually does get better on its own, usually after 12 or 18 months. And I couldn't wait that long. It was very uncomfortable. So I decided to have surgery. And, Well, the second half of my story is that after surgery, I had significant improvement. Like I was able to raise my arm over 90 degrees. By the way, I couldn't raise it more than 25 degrees. So imagine like 25 degrees under my armpit. That's as far as I could raise it. So surgery, like in the first 2 to 3 weeks, I was so excited. I was able to move my shoulder. But then my stress had escalated at that time. And my shoulder went back to before surgery, like it froze up again. And that was when I realized, oh my goodness, my body is telling me something. This is a red flag, and I need to listen to my body. And the message that I got was that I needed to calm the inflammation and stress in my body. And for me, that meant that I needed to leave my job. So it was a really challenging time for me. Although in retrospect, I can see that the discomfort I had in my life at the time, both physically, perhaps emotionally, it forced me to make some life changes that allowed for growth and expansion, and literally, the expansion of my shoulder. And thankfully, I listened to the message from my body.
Wow, this really hit home because the first time I heard you tell this story, I immediately thought about my mom, and I didn't know it was that common. It just went back to when I was younger and my mom was having this really incredible arm pain. I don't know if it was frozen, but I remember she would complain a lot about her arm and she couldn't understand what it was. And when she went to the doctor, they gave her antidepressants, but she didn't want to take them. And it resolved on its own, but I remember very clearly this period of her life when she was going through severe arm discomfort. And yeah, she's a mother of 5, so extreme caregiver.
Yeah. Yeah. It is very common, in middle age, and, it may be hormonal, maybe stress and inflammation. Well, I mean, it is stress and inflammation, but what are the triggers of that? And that's interesting. Her doctor prescribed an antidepressant. Perhaps he recognized that she was stressed as a mother of 5 and, trying to live her life. Speaking of being a mother and a caregiver, I wanted to share a story about my daughter who was around 5 years old at the time. The story is actually about me, but she gave me some insight, and it's a cute story. So if I can, I would like to share it. Around the same time, probably before the frozen shoulder, actually, and this was probably the first clue, like, something's not working in your lifestyle. I was just so busy working, very hard. My daughter, came up to me and, she took her 2 little fingers and put it on the corner of my mouth. And she said, "Mommy, smile." And so, she was trying to tell me that she wanted me to smile. And she was like 5 years old. And my daughter's very intuitive, even from that early age. But it broke my heart that this young child had observed that I wasn't happy, right? That, she could tell, and she was trying to, in her way, help me to be happy by smiling. Which, by the way, even, smiling does change like our body and the message we send back to our brain. I don't know how she knew that. But it was a sign to me that, gosh, if this young girl is noticing that, what I wasn't noticing, I need to make some changes. And, soon after this episode, she did something else that was so profound. She asked me, "Mommy, what are your dreams?" And I just froze. I was trying to think of, what do I tell her? And all I could come up with was, well, mommy's dreams are that your dreams come true. I have to laugh now. I think I sense that she thought that was just an unsatisfactory answer. And, I felt like I disappointed her. But these were some of the early signs that I was noticing, besides my irritability and my moodiness, that my daughter was reflecting back to me, you're not feeling happy. You don't seem joyful. And we're meant to experience joy, and that we should dream at every age. And dreaming for me is simply aligning with what brings us joy. Now, finally, in my middle age, I am dreaming again. I'm trying to create intention for what I want the next phase of my life to look like, or, what do I want for myself? And I think it's very common for middle-aged women to kind of ask those questions, especially if you have children going off to college, you're no longer, that intense caregiver. And finally, you have some space to think about, what are your desires? What are your dreams? But I would say to all women, young women especially, don't wait until you're middle-aged like I am. Start thinking about, what are your dreams? What are your desires? And that is very important for our physical health and well-being.
This is so beautiful, Dr. Julie. Thank you for sharing this. It really hits home because I do see my mother. We all left home, and I can see a sense of, you often think that adolescents are lost, or you're lost when you're younger, but I can see middle-aged women when their lives are also changing that much, because you're busy all the time for a long time, and your purpose, like you shared with your daughter, it almost becomes, your dreams become that your kids are fine, or that they accomplish whatever they dream of, but you don't have any time to think about what you desire. And then all of a sudden you have that space to think about yourself, and you get lost. You're like, wow, I suddenly realize I'm right here, and everything I loved, or everything I thought was my life, is creating their own life. So where is myself, right?
Yeah, we do get lost in being a mom. And that's why it is important to check in with ourselves, right? Have that quiet time to just tap into our inner knowing, our inner wisdom. I didn't do that when my children were young. Now I know that self-care is not selfish, and that it's really important to take that time for ourselves. And it could be something, very simple as just pausing to practice deep breathing, to just be with ourselves and ask, what are my desires? What do I want for myself? And when we do that, I know when I do that, I'm a better mother, and that it's not selfish, right? And so self-care becomes essential to being our best selves, and showing up the way we want for our children. Luckily, I'm an older mother, meaning, my children are still at home. They're still in high school. So I have some time where a lot of women in my age group who had children younger, their kids are off to college. And so the sooner you realize this, the more time you can show up as the mom you want to be. Certainly at the time when I had my frozen shoulder, and before that, I don't think I was showing up. As my daughter, pointed out to me, luckily, I had the frozen shoulder, and it was a wake-up call for me to make some changes in my life that were necessary.
So important to listen to your body in the first stages. If you're irritable, or if someone reflects to you that you're not happy, make a change and you'll avoid a lot of further discomfort or
Yeah,
disease even.
yeah, for sure. I think when it comes from your child, you're just more open. Whereas if it came from my husband, I think I would have gotten defensive. But
Sure.
yeah, and I think young children are so innocent and pure and they just call it as it is, right? Um, yeah. Listen to yourself and those wise people around you, perhaps.
And Dr. Julie, when you reflect on the patients who've taught you the most, what did they reveal about healing that textbooks never could? Was there a patient that showed you something that you hadn't learned through medical studies?
Yeah. So, I have treated a lot of people with SIBO and IBS. So that is, SIBO stands for small intestinal bacteria overgrowth. It's an imbalance in the gut microbiome, and it's thought to be a cause for IBS, one of many causes. And IBS, again, is irritable bowel syndrome. So I treat them with antibiotics or antimicrobial herbs, based on the person's preference. And I observe that those people who are able to balance their nervous system, who don't have a lot of stress, they have a higher likelihood of eradicating the bugs that cause SIBO. And or, certainly if they're practicing mind-body techniques and balancing their nervous system, the protocol works better. For those who have a lot of stress or have a lot of thoughts that cause stress in their bodies, or they're not practicing mind-body techniques, often it's harder to get rid of the SIBO, or they get rid of it and their symptoms come back soon thereafter, sometimes a couple weeks, sometimes a month. By the way, it is often hard to get rid of SIBO. And this is an example where our nervous system is so important for healing, especially digestive health. Our entire digestive system is innervated by our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. If you recall in our first episode, or many people are familiar with sympathetic nervous system, which is that fight or flight nervous system, right? This is really important for us to adapt to any acute stressors that we have. But when stress is chronic, persistent, or severe, and we're not doing anything to, calm that stress response in our body, it can have a negative impact on our body, and it certainly can impede healing or slow it down. And certainly when we're in fight or flight nervous system, it's not a priority for the body to heal, right? We're still fighting, or we're running away, from that saber-toothed tiger, in our human history. And it's not yet time to heal. And it's when we get into parasympathetic nervous system, which is the relaxation response, also known as rest and digest, or it's after that saber-toothed tiger has, run away, that our body can go into healing mode. So our nervous system is really key to healing. And I have seen this firsthand where, if someone is in, fight or flight, the majority of their day, and they're not doing anything to mitigate that stress, or they can't get rid of whatever stressor in their life, it's harder to heal. And so SIBO is one kind of tangible example, but you can use it for many other conditions.
And having said all this, Dr. Julie, because you mentioned that it's important to know your patient's story and background. How do you balance listening to their story with interpreting lab results and medical evidence?
Well, both are important data, right? Um, I think the title of this podcast is how a person's story is a part of their data. And in fact, we're taught in medical school that um, something like 70 to 80% of diagnoses can be made from a thorough medical history alone. This is before the physical exam and before test results. So the story is very, very important. And I think in addition to the story, you have to understand what are the current stressors of this person? What are their former life stressors? And you have to put it all together. When we train in functional medicine, we're taught to create a timeline of the person's life story. In other words, map out different events that were key to triggering their symptoms or their disease, and were there life events that continue that process, which we call mediators. And so that is all really important to understand. But we also want to collect that objective data that you're talking about. When we say subjective data, that's the story. That's important, right? The objective data is the physical exam, doing a battery of blood work, or even specialty testing that we do in functional medicine. And this gives us a deeper dive or deeper look under the hood to see what's at play, what is imbalanced, what do we need to correct. And so that laboratory testing is important. And I know that many of my patients love seeing their data, right? It tells them, what needs to be fixed and what changes need to be made in their lifestyle to improve their numbers. But the reality is, though science has progressed so rapidly and we can test so many things, there's still a lot that we don't understand about the functioning of the human body, right? And that we haven't come up with testing everything in our body. And so there's still some mystery, or, there are things that we just don't have the ability at this time to test for. And so we really have to then use the patient's story to give us those clues. So I balance both and bring it all together for me to understand, what are the root causes at play here? What are the things that we need to address to improve this person's symptoms or to improve this chronic condition?
Do you find it that when you look at the data, the objective data that is the chemistry part of the diagnosis, do you find it that it often reflects the story? When they tell you their lives, you can see it in the labs?
Often, yes. Often, no. So I think it happens very often where all your blood work looks normal, right? And it's not clear why you have fatigue. Blood work is extremely important. We need to look at all the nutrients that are important for energy production. Make sure the person's not anemic or have iron deficiency or a B12 deficiency. We need to look at their hormones, their thyroid, look for inflammation. All of these things need to be ruled out. I think the problem is when they're all normal, right? And you've done a deep dive, meaning, really, ordering a vast array of blood work, and you still don't have something abnormal to hang your hat on, then it becomes kind of frustrating. Like, well, then what is the cause of the fatigue? Well, I think that's where the functional medicine lens can be helpful, where we have these specialty tests. We can do salivary hormone testing to look at adrenal function beyond just, the blood work. We can look at gut health. Gut health is the foundation of health everywhere else, including our energy. And so there are so many more pieces to look at beyond just blood work. My favorite thing to look at is lifestyle. I mean, let's go back a few steps. We don't have to get that fancy just yet, and just look at, are they eating well, making sure they're getting enough nutrients? Are they spiking their blood sugar and their energy crashes right after their blood sugar crashes? Is that making them feel anxious, right? When our blood sugar is not stable and it's going up and down, that can cause all sorts of symptoms. Are they sleeping well? I mean, that's basic, right? When we think about energy, for example. Are they stressed from their job? And it's causing inflammation in their body, and then their mitochondria aren't functioning so well, or their adrenal health is impaired and their cortisol is actually really low. So, these are the things that I think about when I look at a person's lifestyle. I may not need the fancy testing, right? Especially if someone can afford it. I feel really confident using my clinical skills and listening to that person's story. And my clinical experience has taught me, well, this is very likely, adrenal insufficiency, and they need some lifestyle support to improve their adrenal health as a foundation, improve sleep. And sometimes I'll give some supplements to support the functioning of the adrenal glands. So it's sort of a stepwise process, and I try one thing. If that doesn't work, then, let's try something else. And it varies from person to person, and that's where the personalization comes in. And I think for the person listening, start by examining your own lifestyle. Be a little detective. What makes your symptoms worse, right? Pay attention. Is it certain foods you eat? What makes you feel better? And if you haven't felt good in a long while, think back. When did you first, I'm sorry, when did you, was there a time when you felt well, right? And think about what was going on in your life. For many of us, it was before we had kids. Certainly for me. And what was I doing in my activities, in my lifestyle to help me feel good? And so we can start with just our own, kind of detective, asking questions of ourselves and looking at our lifestyle. And if you're stuck, find a clinician, a good clinician to help you figure out, what are the underlying causes? Get some testing done. But I think, when we talk about how the medical history can really give us 70 to 80% of, our diagnoses, I think that's where we should spend a good part of the time. And that's why in my visits, I do take the time to find out that life story. And, it does give me a lot of clues, and even something that happened 5 years ago can be impacting your health today.
Would you say, because I resonate with this that you said, I've been in the position where I know that I'm not in the best health that I could be because I just don't feel well. And it's sometimes too hard to pinpoint what it is that you're feeling. You just know that you're not feeling comfortable. So I can see how many listeners will resonate with this statement. It's hard to know. But what I was trying to say is so that there's things that they can look out for in themselves. But also, you mentioned that something that happened 5 years ago could be still like coded in their body. I don't know if that's the word to use, but even if their life looks well today, something that happened a long time ago can still be affecting them.
Yeah. So, one example is trauma. Um, if you had a traumatic episode, especially a traumatic childhood, and this is well known, this is well established in the medical literature. It's called adverse childhood events, ACEs. And we know that the higher your ACE score, the more physical symptoms you'll have as an adult. Um, so yes, that's why your whole life history, starting, gosh, in utero with, your mother's pregnancy, her delivery, that all matters. And that's something that I ask about, in my questionnaire when people first come to my practice, because it all matters. Trauma impacts our nervous system. And there's actually a third nervous system. It's thought to be the freeze nervous system. And in this state, this is, after people have experienced trauma, their nervous system is at a point where they can cause more stress on their body, as we've talked about in fight or flight. But there's also, some dissociation, and people, as a protective mechanism, don't want to be in touch with themselves, or they want to dissociate from that memory or from themselves. I am not a trauma expert. I do know, through my patients, they've taught me how trauma has impacted their current adult health and their symptoms. And so I've had to learn about trauma and how that impacts our body. That's a more complex topic, and we can go deeper in another episode. But a more tangible example, that is a tangible example. I don't mean to say that it's not, but something we can measure. It's harder to measure trauma, though you could probably measure it through all sorts of neat devices now that we have, like heart rate variability and things of that nature. But I was getting to things like toxins, right? Exposure to toxins, whether it's, chemicals in our food or our makeup or occupational exposure, that will impact our cellular health, therefore, can cause all sorts of problems. So that's another example of where that timeline of events in your life that you may not, put much importance on, will be a data point for an expert clinician or a functional medicine clinician. And it's up to us to kind of tie it all together for you.
That's so interesting that you mentioned that, because I think that a lot of us don't even have that data. So that's where the detective comes in, I guess. We don't know what our mothers were going through during their pregnancy. And I find it that at least my mother romanticizes so much pregnancy that she only talks about, or having kids, she only talks about the good part, but doesn't even, I don't know if she remembers the hard parts of it, or just doesn't feel like it's okay to share. So that's an important thing. And when you mentioned about trauma, I can see how trauma also fuels your behavior, but your trauma can shape the way you behave, and that can impact your health, right? Because it's also your choices.
Sure. Especially if it's untreated, right?
Absolutely. So, well, just a little review. I know we talked about the ecosystem of health, and we will be talking about this a lot more because, as I understand, it's like the foundation of our health. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I'd like to go back to the example of my frozen shoulder. Um, so even though I had a top surgeon from a top institution, I didn't have the ecosystem for health and healing properly after surgery. And that's why, it went back to the same state before surgery. And I believe that it was due to the fact that I still had drivers of inflammation. It was like, my body was not yet done. I had my ongoing stressors. I had my busy life, not prioritizing self-care, and that these were all, triggers and mediators of the original frozen shoulder, but they were also reasons why I didn't heal from having surgery. Like most people, they get the surgery and their shoulder's all better, right? That's usually what happens. And I know that, that was the message from my body, and I'm grateful for my body for like, you're not done yet. There's still more work you need to do. I do think if my shoulder had improved after surgery, it would have been, oh, great. And I don't think I would have left my job at the time. I could have kept going. Like I was fine, mostly. And this is where it gets, into the spiritual domain or, trying to understand what my soul was telling me. And that my soul was not aligned with my job at the time. And the discomfort of the frozen shoulder and not recovering from surgery, forced me to leave my job because that was a necessary component of my ecosystem for health. I needed to find a job that aligned with my spirit. And I did. I found a job that was very inspiring. It was doing the work that I loved, integrative medicine or functional medicine. I had many colleagues that were like-minded, and we built a sense of community, and I just loved the work that I did there. And though we were busy and, I worked hard, I enjoyed it. And that alignment allowed my spirit to thrive. And, I no longer felt so stuck. And frozen shoulder is like a metaphor for stuckness, right? Like my shoulder was literally stuck. And so, that was, I guess, the ecosystem of health when we think about our work environment, our career. You could think of it in our, social environment. At its foundation are just the basic pillars of health and well-being, right? I'll say this over and over again, but, good nutrition, optimal sleep, movement, managing our nervous system, social connection with ourself, perhaps connection, with our spirit, our soul. I didn't know this at that time. I had no idea. Even though, I was this, doctor who practiced, mind-body medicine, like it took me a while to figure that out. And this is really in hindsight. And the hindsight that I have is, it's okay to experience stress and discomfort. That's life, right? And, we have to pay attention to how it impacts our body, our mind, and make changes so that we can feel good in our body, in our mind, and in our spirit. And, I would say that, not all stress is bad, right? Certainly, stress got me through medical school and my training. It helped me to be better. But it's when the stress is really high, right? Or you don't have the ecosystem, to create more resilience in your body. And when I had my frozen shoulder, my ecosystem was not optimal. And maybe that's why I got the frozen shoulder, right? It's not clear, but I think it was a blessing that I had that signal from my body. And I would say, at the time I was really annoyed that my surgery didn't work, right? And it's like, why? But now in hindsight, I realize I needed to leave that job and I needed a stronger message from my body.
Dr. Julie, you mentioned not all stress is bad, and that's a good point to share because I've heard so much about, there was like a current that was speaking of, just really take care of everything and, don't be stressed and don't be bothered and kind of like, if you don't like this, then just leave it. That kind of mentality, which I think that in your case with your frozen shoulder, it was, okay, this physical, like my body's not functioning properly because I need to make changes. And so that part is clear. But then also you speak about resilience. So there are times where one has to become stronger or more aligned within so that they can push through or go through whatever is uncomfortable in their lives at the moment, maybe things that can't change.
Yeah. So certainly, a mindset is helpful, right? And the mindset is, I can do hard things. That's my theme. And, I think if we all reflect back in our lives, and the older you are, the more stuff to reflect on, we've all had challenges in our life. That's life. Life is stressful and that's how we become better. But when I talk about resilience, I do mean that when we're taking good care of ourselves, right? Again, eating well, sleeping well, just sleeping well, will make you more resilient. When you're underslept, you're just cranky, right? Just like babies. And so when you're taking care of yourself, and that's what I mean by self-care, right? Taking care of ourselves in that deeper way, or just social connection. I wish I could say, do this one thing, but that's why I use the word ecosystem, because it's all of the above, and that can feel overwhelming. And, you can't do all of it at once. You have to do one step at a time. And what's the most impactful step, right? But you got to do something. You have to act, right? Make a decision, make a change.
Even if that change is just working out or like you say, taking 5 minutes to walk somewhere.
Right. And for each of us, that ecosystem is going to look different, right? My ecosystem is going to look different than what your ecosystem is for your health. But to start thinking about, gosh, what are those pieces that help me to feel good in my body, in my mind, and in my spirit? So, it's all of the above, but don't get overwhelmed. Start one step at a time.
And Dr. Julie, now looking back, if you could tell your younger self one truth about health and symptoms, what would that be?
Yeah. I would say to my younger self, don't be afraid of discomfort. They are like teachers for growth. They are motivators of needed change. And when you move through the discomfort, you can bring about positive change if you choose it, right? You have to choose it. You got to take action, as we talked about just a minute ago. But it's hard to have that understanding until you've gone through some hard times, right? And that's what age provides, right? That wisdom. And you have to build that confidence and that knowledge that, you can do hard things. And that is the resilience. I think it's hard to just tell yourself I'm resilient. You have to kind of show yourself. And that's why we shouldn't be afraid of discomfort, right? I mean, I don't want, you have to like suffer, right? And we have to find ways to alleviate our suffering, right? And so I would also tell my younger self that, and we can all tell our younger self this, that, you did a good job.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, I brought up the example of my daughter and like, oh, that, makes me a little sad, but it's in the past. I did the best that I could. And thankfully I woke up from that, right? I became aware and I made some changes. And so I did a good job.
Yes, that's so powerful. I think that little do we say that to ourselves, and the impact that just saying that to ourselves can have is huge. So that's a good invitation to our listeners to stay with. Tell yourself you did a good job, no matter how old you are. Thank you, Dr. Julie. We've come close to the end of our episode. So much to talk about on next episode. Is there anything that you would like to say before we close?
Yeah. So please remember, this podcast is for information only and it's not medical advice. Always check in with your own doctor on what's right for you.
Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Medicine with Meaning. If today's conversation resonated with you, share it with someone who might need this message, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's ahead. Together with Dr. Julie Ta, we'll keep exploring how evidence-based medicine and heart-centered wisdom can help you heal not just your body, but your whole self. We'll see you next time.
Bye-bye and thank you.